starting
Yes.
slide, I presume?
Yes.
Okay, and now I'm in the awkward position of having to talk to myself, thinking that you have all gone for coffee. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Gerry Leonidas. I am an expatriate. I'm Greek of origin, and I currently live and work in the UK at the University of Reading, where I'm a professor in the Department of Typography. The relevant hat I wear here is one where I run a master's program focusing on typeface design and work with PhD students in this area as well. Most of the stuff that we do has one foot in the digital domain and one foot in the design/humanities side. So I'm going to be somewhat insulting and assume that you don't know anything about what we do. So my first few slides is just getting some basics right, just make sure that I've got some bases covered, and then I will go on to things that I think more relevant to what we're doing. So you're all aware of fonts as things on your computer, or if you're using any more complex page layout applications, you will have seen the numerous fonts that are available to anybody using any up-to-date computer. And these are individual software resources on your desktop. And indeed, you can get hold of them through any of the major software publishers, or you could have some contract with a provider of fonts that you lease fonts, for example, FontStand, or you could get them freely from the internet, either Google Fonts or any number of other services. So the most important thing to keep in mind at the outset is that fonts cannot really be discussed outside their channels of distribution. As digital resources, they are tied to how they reach their users. So depending on the user's models, we might have different ways of reaching them, but essentially they are indistinguishable as a product, as a service from the systems that make them reach people. That is interesting for us because the limitations or the potentials of the systems influence what fonts can do. Now, if we start digging into fonts, there's many ways of looking into them, but a very simple way of thinking of them is as simple matrices with a lot of characters in that correspond to different scripts and so on. And what is important from our perspective is that these resources hold outlines, individual digital data corresponds to shapes, but also quite a lot of information that allows us to customize the behavior of these shapes in terms of things that are attached to them, such as diacritics, or this behavior of shapes when they're adjacent to others. So I'm assuming that everybody is familiar with Unicode, which is an encoding standard that documents, let's say, the totality of scripts and symbolic elements used by humans, which looks in its purest form in something like this. It's a standard that has a table of content with canonical descriptions of things and some rules about how things combine or not, and indicative representations. And that is one half of a font structure. And the other half is something that exists within the font, which is a second system of numbering that allows us to do smarter things with multiple versions of the font. So there's two systems of numbering that essentially allows us to distinguish between, for example, base forms and forms that have additional marks attached to them that have conditional rules that may allow the marks to appear or not appear, or change shape or disappear, and so on. There are limitations in the system in the kind of relationships that you can have, and also to how you can describe what is a very rich set of shapes that people have produced over millennia into something that expects a quite clear programmatic description of shapes. But this combination of a description that follows a strict definition of content, and then a second step that focuses on the appearance of, on the possibilities for appearance of this, is what enables fonts to function quite flexibly. So a very simple example is Arabic, which have, for conventional reasons, initial, medial, and final forms. for letters. That is a feature that is enabled through this two-tier encoding of visible forms to fonts. So far, so good. That is fairly simple. Of course, as the complexities of the shapes we want to produce increase, then we can see the systems might be able or not to cater for this. And in this case, for example, I'm showing some Arabic text, but I'm not specifying what period, historical period that Arabic might be from, what region. So I'm not taking into account any variations in geography or history. I might not be taking into account historical changes in the spelling of words and so on. These are complexities to the system. So what is a second really important takeaway is that the fundamentals of fonts can be enabling and empowering because they allow people to communicate, but also they can be prohibitive and controlling because exactly they have to make strict decisions about what is this version of Arabic that I'm going to enable in my system or not. They are therefore advantages for a community, or they could be critical threats because they might not enable a generation to educate the next generation into the script that they're used to using. I've got a couple of interesting examples in these that we're seeing quite substantial communities in size until very recently being relatively ignored. This is an article that it's about 8 months old, about academic output being produced in a native language that was not properly accommodated within the education framework. And that is, you would argue, integral to the continuity of that community to be able to produce new knowledge in its native language. If you want complexities, then the Indian subcontinent is a wonderful case study where we have a multiplicity of scripts which are serving a much larger number of indigenous languages, dialects, variations, and so on. And there we have seen at the extreme this problem of canonical versions of scripts being associated with, let's say, national level or large community level representations of a language, and then a lot of smaller languages being sort of brushed aside until more recently, where there has been a redoubted effort to document them properly. I'll return to this. I drew this inside. This is from a couple of years ago because this is interesting when the business community is beginning to pay attention to fonts. This is Tifinag, you can see. It is interesting to see how they talk about something like this, that they recognize that in order to access what the business community would see as the market potential of certain regions or communities, they realize at some point that unless you can talk to people in their own native language, in their own native script, then you've got a problem. So there's an increasing recognition of the value of fonts. So what I'm going to focus on, and apologies if I've talked about things that people think are commonplace or very well known, but our approach to developing fonts as infrastructure. And I've got a picture of my friend Patma Gotavata, who lives somewhere outside Colombo. We've developed this approach together. The idea is that there are certain levels through which you can take a community that has some mode of communication that has a written representation, and then you can start supporting it. And once you say, I support something, then that becomes a problem because you have to say, what does this mean? Of course, the combination or the overlap of scripts and languages is not very clean, and in reality, it's more something like this, especially any language that has seen historical changes, community changes, migration patterns, and so on, is actually quite difficult to capture in one single canonical form. That ties into all sorts of interesting discussions that from the 18th, 19th century onwards are very commonplace in terms of the relationship of language to community to nation and so on. And this is the sort of down-to-earth digital result of these. And of course, you have to think, how do we bring all these things together? Because for what many of us might be thinking, a lot of that stuff applies to a mobile phone. Well, what are the possibilities within that system to deliver a script for a language at any given time. So the obvious zero starting point is nothing. And that is actually extremely common still. This is an academic text from not too long ago, where an older academic was just typewriting his text and would insert by hand in this case, Greek alternate script with also some phonetic transcriptions that he was adding, because he had no access to any mechanical system that typeset the text wanted. And that's actually quite common. What we might be very common of is systems of reproduction that appear printed but are not really typeset. So this is a case of some characters that are Chinese that are actually written in a lithographic stone and then photocopied or photographed and then photocopied again. We might all be familiar with music printing. Music until very recently was often produced in the same manner as well, with people writing out the music and then being lithographically produced. So if you're thinking of a system there, you have a multiplication system, but you don't have a typesetting system. That happened until very recently, for example, Persian newspapers, which used to be written out and then multiplied. So then you might have a very simple representation, and here is a bias towards the scripts that are easier to represent that way. This is it's about 35-year-old Greek font, which has one version of each character digitally, but they are not encoded in any way that this can be used in more than one system setup. So if you had a Windows 3.1 machine and somebody else had exactly the same setup, you could give them a document and they could open it. The moment that parity of systems and setup broke, then the document would be unreadable. And a lot of pre-Unicode documents function that way. There's quite a lot of work being done to recover these kind of older texts. We're getting a bit more interesting things when we are introducing this Unicode encoding, which allows us then to have rather large character sets to distinguish between accents, multiple accents in ways that we can transfer the documents. And this is quite a fundamental step, because then it means that we can send a document across devices and it will survive. But it doesn't equip us in doing anything more than something like this, what you see on the screen, the equivalent of plain text document, where we're just speaking in a monotone voice. So it is something that is typographically very inadequate, but from a content point of view, it enables us to make steps into authoring and so on. And there are all sorts of interesting problems when this breaks, and we can see this. I mentioned my friend before, Sinhala on Facebook until very recently looked like this. This is quite frustrating because the content below the boxes is actually Sinhala. It survives and it is translated, so Facebook will translate it, but there is no visual representation because the system font that is shipping with the device that this is rendered on doesn't provide the right characters. Now you can see there the implications for enabling or disempowering people, because this sends a message to people that if you want, maybe you need to do what we can see at the bottom right, where that person has actually phonetically transcribed the Sinhala text in Latin characters. And that happens in pretty much any script you can guess that has been done at some point, where people try to appropriate one script and use it for another. This always is seen as something that is excused within the confines of a limited system, in the same way that we would excuse a roughness in a typewritten text, but not expect that kind of appearance in a properly printed book. So there is an implicit agreement there by the users that this is not something that you would expect to see in a newspaper or a magazine that is professionally produced, but it is an accommodation for a limitation in the system. But of course, the problem there is, even if the font has the right characters, you need to access them somehow. And there you're tied into the limitations of either hardware or software entry systems, which need to exist. So you could have a font with the right characters, but then you need a keyboard and you need a way of distributing and explaining the keyboard to the community. This is a keyboard that was developed last year for Granta, which is a short of extinct script. It doesn't have a living community of native users, but has an active community of academics and people who study the language using it. And you have an obvious problem of a script that has many more characters than the standard keyboard can use, having to appropriate an entirely different set of conventions for inputting these. So it's always a set of limitations. And of course, this is not something that comes with the system. It has to be added later for the users or through user initiative and so on. So there's also these hurdles in jumping through this level of support. Once you go a bit further, this is from the example I showed you before. These are fundamental resources for children, people who learn the language. And you have the very interesting example of an elementary text in 3 scripts, one of which might be extremely important because it is a signal difference that will enable the community to train the next generation. But these are very simple forms of representation. So once these children need to read something that is more dense typographically, has more text per page, or need to work on very small screens, the form that we see there might not be appropriate, might not be visible, might not render clearly, might get the wrong tone and so on. So it's a fairly elementary level of supporting the language. Similar things can happen in language like these. This is from a project that we did a few years ago for supporting with a typographically competent typeface. I'm not going to say all, a substantial subset of the Amazonian communities in Brazil. Now, this is an interesting case because these are oral communities where the script has been imported in a sense. So it is alien to the writing tradition, or the tool tradition of the culture. So there's interesting loan elements that need to be adapted to a script that was never imagined with these kind of conventions. And the double stacking diacritics are a very good case in point. But if you realize that actually enabling the representatives of that community to be able to document properly the language is a critical for survival issue for them, then projects like these, they're not simply design projects, they are essential service to the community. Once you move a bit further, then you need to add complexity to these things. And this is where societies really begin to function, when you can have administration, education, transactions, and so on. And for that, you need at least 2 levels of hierarchy. A simple representation here is something that has what we call a regular and a bold, that allows you to essentially build list elements or visual hierarchies that allow people to navigate complex information. Government websites, anything that has to do with form filling and so on, things that have to do with fundamental interfaces where there's a difference between the voice of the author and the voice of the system. All of this stuff needs this kind of complexity. And Facebook, which I'm sort of overusing here as an example of things breaking, is a very good case in point where you will see almost never anything in italic, but you will see very carefully calibrated sizing of typefaces and also weight. And you can see on the top left where the news feed bit is a heavier weight, exactly to give the visual hierarchy some emphasis. So that stuff is quite important. Once you start supporting basic transaction education, then things get more relevant in fully supporting the whole community. And that has to do mostly with optical sizes, making sure that something that works at a large size in a book or a newspaper or something might also work on a small phone. Here I've got examples of characters for large sizes and for small sizes. And you can see the 2 lowercase a's on the bottom, how different they are when we look at them up close, but actually when you look at them at their natural size, they give you the same impression. These kind of refinements are not aesthetic considerations, all the aesthetics come into it. They are fundamental accessibility features that enable people to read texts of a sufficient density on screen, and also enable people with imperfect eyesight or gradually failing eyesight to be able to continue to be active members of that community. And the more we shift towards smaller screens, the more important this becomes. And of course, I'm sort of cheating here because I'm showing you quite easy to render forms. If we look at some more complex scripts that have multiple strokes per character, then this accessibility requirement becomes quite important. I'm showing you a mock-up from a relatively recent research project by a student, where he was looking at the typographical requirements for augmented reality. This is an imagined interface for a medical application. What is interesting for us is that you can see that the one of the physicians taking part is rendering his text in Devanagari, in Hindi. So the density of the Devanagari letter forms is higher than that of the Latin. So a lot of conventions might not transfer easily across scripts. In these kinds of environments where the background changes a lot, you might have parallax factors coming in and so on. And this is going to be an area that is exploding in use in the next few years as certain devices enable this. And then the criticality of clear reading of these letter forms becomes absolutely obvious. Another area that is interesting is that of letter forms that are actually floating in relation to objects. This is an interesting mock-up for a game that is entirely virtual. And there is very little understanding for how do we render letter forms there? How much density do we put in? How much text is somebody able to parse while they're also paying attention to something else on the screen? What we're seeing here is an extreme version of somebody driving and looking at a heads-up display on their windscreen and their car. But this is again coming, and a lot of research is needed to see what is an optimum typographic density and representation of text in these environments. And then, of course, the accessibility has more mundane environments in what we might think of the full range of devices and scales that something might be seen. So for things to appear consistent and coherent across all the distribution channels, multiple versions of fonts might need to appear, or you might have to consider quite smart technology in the background to make sure that these things function efficiently. We get a bit more complicated when we start looking at different conventions and expectations that people have. This is a typeface specifically for early years education applications, where there are certain conventions about how to render mathematical symbols, for example. In this case, you want the fractions to behave a certain way because the children are expected to copy them from these examples and so on. So this kind of refinement might be considered on one level as a niche industry, but if you think that all the children go through school at a certain period, they need to learn certain conventions in a clear way, especially in an environment where resources are used for copying from, this becomes quite important. And of course, we're looking at the multiplicity of the tones of voice in online communication right now, where we have multiple levels of authorship. So we have a text here of an interview, and then we have links to things, we have annotations to things, and then we have commentary on annotations. So there's about 18 different kinds of text in this interface alone that need a sufficient typographic representation if we start looking at everything in detail. And the last level where we might think this is a goal for reaching typographic maturity and supporting a community is to be able to provide a full richness of choice to people who are producing content in a competing environment. These are news services or the equivalent of magazines and so on that need to distinguish themselves from their competitors and need a certain typographic style that matches their brand or their functions and so on. And what will work for here will not work for the government service that I showed earlier or the education. So this kind of richness in font provision is something that allows us to produce something that, especially in small interfaces, gives us a typographic richness. So coming back to what we see on our devices, these kinds of multiplicities of styles and fonts is not something that's a superfluous style. The reason for the multiplicity is because it's very difficult to guess exactly what people need. So you need to have almost an oversupply of options in order to enable authors, producers of content, and so on, to fine-tune and pick exactly the right tone of voice that they need. But what we might aim to is something like this, where we might have quite complex typographic arrangements, which need to coordinate in terms of their typographic balance, and also ideas of primacy and so on. Visual primacy for especially if you're doing list elements where you need to look at something in specific orders and so on. And again, coming back to things like this, which I think are increasingly becoming the standard by which we need to judge typographic competence, the idea of multiple levels of authorship coexisting in a clear way on fairly fluid formats and devices. The goal has to be able to typeset something that has that kind of typographic complexity in its background, but also is flexible and available. I'm going to close with two jokes, because if I ask my Chinese friends, is the Chinese italic, they will say no. However, here we have an interesting case where we have an italicized set of Chinese characters simply because the editorial style of the authoring environment identifies with italics a quoted phrase. And it works okay in the text above, where we have psychiatry and religion, and so on, and that's a book title convention. And then the idiom then is forcefully italicized below. And if you think that's extreme, there you can also look at the bottom right here, where the italics have also spilled over into the emoji, and now we have an italic emoji. Now, this might appear a bit silly in this case, but this is how we've seen a lot of italics or slanted forms appear in a lot of scripts through the potential of the authoring system being applied to scripts that never were supposed to use these things, but actually then enable new behaviors. So we might very well see variations of symbolic representations like this developing. And of course, variable fonts give us a lot of possibility. This is the latest technology to build quite a lot of typographic refinement and this kind of offering, and almost skip through some of these stages that I outlined by building systems with the last step in mind, but actually allow the earlier ones to progress more gradually. So a little bit of strategic thinking in the font offerings for specific scripts or sets of scripts can go a long way in enabling communities to jump through these levels of provision. So I think I've given you some things to think about. I'm going to stop sharing. Can I stop sharing? I can stop sharing. Yes. Okay. And I'm back. And no, everybody's here. Nobody left. That's good.
Thank you so much, Gerry. Ευχαριστώ. It was very, very enlightening. I think some of it was very technical for some of us, but it's a very necessary step, right?
I think, well, there is a necessity to deal a little bit with the technology, because it gives us the envelope within which we can do things.
Yes.
And I think I tend to think of all the technology related to this as on a need-to-know basis, that I need to have a clear idea of how much do you need to understand what technology can do or not, to be able to have the conversations with the people who are 100% technologists, to understand how they can help you and what information you can give them to enable what you want to do. I say I'm not a trained technologist myself. My first degree in business, then I started typography. Everything I've learned about software, I've learned on my own. And if I can learn a few things on my own at my age, people can do quite a lot of things when they're younger. But the basic principles are not prohibitive. It is possible to understand what is it that breaks. So you meet someone who says, I'll give you an easy example. You meet someone who tries to transcribe a language, and they don't have a character that they need to indicate a certain notation, a certain diacritic. Then if you give them enough knowledge to understand that why does this thing not appear there, then you then allow them to go to someone and say, I need my character set to be expanded.
Yes.
So that kind of discussion.
Yes, and it is true that we do have a lot of communities that need to get their scripts online and their fonts and everything. And all this Language Digitization Initiative, we're trying to cover all the bases. We're trying to bring technologists. We're trying to bring professors like yourself who are actually steeped into this particular font and typography to give us the full picture. And it would be wrong for a community to embark on digitizing their script without understanding all the complexities that this entails, right?
I think it is very useful to have a few conversations before, yes, because otherwise people are at the risk of having to reinvent the wheel. It's really good to say, oh, this thing that you're going through is similar to that kind of project. Somebody else did this, maybe this is the method they followed, or this is the kind of information that you will need. Go and speak to, I'll give you an example. We worked a few years ago with a student developing support for Native American communities, the script. A case where a digital version of the script did not exist until that point. Now, that doesn't make it much different from any other script transcription into digital case where you need to say, I need to figure out how do you write. I need to find out the range of forms that people make. So can you show me, please, some adult competent writers? And I will have them write some things for me. So then I build a library of written forms. Then I might try to connect these to any resources that there are about the language, the grammar, the syntax, so I can see what rules I need to encode in the font and so on. So the research and documentation at the outset can save a huge amount of effort later on.
Yes. So I'd like to ask our viewers if they have any questions for Gerry.
So I have a couple. This is Tex. Thanks. The presentation was brilliant. So, but on the one hand, it's helpful for a community to understand all of the complexities and challenges that they might face. But on the other hand, how can we present some kind of staging or phasing of the work so it isn't so overwhelming? But also, maybe also there's some complexity here that communities don't need in at least in starting out. So, and also, are there some metrics that we can offer so that a community might be able to say, well, I'm this far along in maturity. I know there's more to do, but I can accomplish some minimal level, or I understand what I'm not going to get if I don't have some of these features. I think there needs to be some way for a community to say, well, I want to get to some level. I want to be able to, for example, support an education level of, high school level words and presentation, or, maybe even a lower level, or a more sophisticated level. And also, so that's kind of one basic question. But then the other is, I wonder if some of these requirements aren't geared towards a more Western level of typography and layout. So the more sophisticated ones, the more advertising-oriented ones strike me as being more Western typography, especially the use of italics and italicizing emoji and some of those. And I'm not saying that they should be ignored, but it makes me also wonder if there aren't some requirements in other languages that should also get some emphasis that maybe we wouldn't think of if we weren't looking at Western examples. Maybe, those examples were chosen because you're speaking to a Western audience, but so help me understand, those two pieces.
That's quite easy. I can answer the last question first because it is the easiest one. I did not choose Western examples. I didn't show Western stuff with any particular reason, just because this roadmap, which is something that you can plan essentially over several years of work, culminates at the typographic complexity that is most competently represented by Western scripts, Latin, Cyrillic, Greek, increasingly Arabic, Hebrew is doing quite well in that area, and so on. So I'm quite agnostic as to what I'm looking at, but what I can see, and I do this throughout traveling and looking at information in other regions, especially Asia, is that there is a gradual progression in the typographic complexity within a community as you get a more developed urban/middle class environment. So if you have a community which is mostly rural, or there isn't enough of a service-oriented sector, then you have simpler forms of typography. The moment you see a shift towards urbanization and a more educated environment, a higher proportion of higher educated population, and especially an environment you might see in big cities, which are geared to services, then always you see typography moving very rapidly up towards the higher levels of this. Very good examples of this are Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, which in a space of especially 3 decades or even less in the case of Thailand and Vietnam, went through the equivalent of what in Europe was over 150 years of typographic development, almost development on steroids of developing typographic richness, very complex forms, on the forms that developed both the more historical representation of the script and more, let's say, modern or contemporary, exactly because people wanted to be able to do this. And one other area where this is expressing itself, which I didn't touch on, is the multi-script applications that are growing rapidly. So what we are seeing is that most of the people, and I'm saying very much outside North America, which is an island of insularity as far as I'm concerned typographically, very inward looking in that respect. The moment you look outside, then you realize that people are functionally biscriptal. So you might be walking in the streets of Moscow and you will see an ad that will be in Cyrillic but have bits in Latin, and you see the same thing in Thailand and you see the same thing in Japan now. You will see a huge rate of change. Actually, Japan's a very good case because of the Olympics. The Olympics accelerated this result. Beijing has transformed itself exactly because of the double Olympics coming up into a much more biscriptal urban environment, which means then a typographic support for this. So what I see this is as societies that have a longer established urban/services set of communities, having had the time over decades, many decades or centuries, to develop a rich typographic environment. And we see in other societies a much more accelerated pace on this. And that is enabled by digital resources, because in the West, it had to happen through technologies that had to do with smelting metal and printing things on paper very slowly and expensively. And now it costs very little for someone in Bangalore to develop a font variant that has different weights or different styles and so on. So the digital has accelerated this kind. So I'm not seeing this as something that is a Western-centric view. I'm seeing this as what is the typographic complexity that any given community requires to do its business, in the widest sense of the word, at each point in its development. So Granta that I showed, because it's a script only for academics, a single form of the script is sufficient. Devanagari, which is used by hundreds of millions of people in everything from mobile phones to classical text to you name it, needs a very rich typographic repertoire. And the conventions for this feed a lot of the existing typographic scene around us. There is a Western set of forms that often serve as the exemplars for the first versions of these explorations. So the first version of modern Devanagari is very Western looking, and you get 15 years of this until a generation grows up and says, well, that's actually not native to us, that's imported, but that's okay. We can throw it away and do our own. This has happened in India. It has happened in the Arabic world, where the first version of rich typographic forms for Arabic were very Latinized. And the next generation of designers, producers have really turned their back on these and say these are not intrinsic to our culture, but it's almost like a saga that you have to go through until a culture realizes we don't really need this kind of imported novelty. We have the capacity as a culture to develop our own richness with our own resources. And that happens almost without exception throughout any society that goes through this process of typographic development. And now your earlier question, how do I do this? There's a number of options. One has to do with what's funding related. All of these things we've done is to find people who are from the local community and can function as change agents. And then you extract them for a period of time, and you might have some sort of workshops or training sessions, or you might have some longer periods of study so they can build the skills and then go back and develop them. So we've done this with people from Nepal, we've done this a few years back with people from India and so on. And these people then function as their own as hubs in their own communities. That is it's an expensive way of doing things. It can be quite effective if you've got the right people, because then they go back and then they can train others very quickly. Another way that becomes more and more easy has to do with doing things online, with identifying people in the right communities. And if I may be allowed to see a positive in the current situation that we are going through, I think the enforced lock of each of us in our home office or sofa or kitchen table has accelerated this process of thinking of how are we going to do this online. We are doing more of these we're having these conversations with people. Oh, instead of flying for 3 days to Egypt or Sri Lanka, I can't do this. How will we do this thing online? So then producing online resources that will directly train people locally to do things. But that is again on a demand side, that you need to have someone there that will need to do this. I'm interested also in a supply side, something where I might say, what can I put up online so that somebody who searches, how do I start documenting my script, or script digitization for idiots or something, that will come up. We've got a couple of projects for these in progress, making available online first research pieces that document scripts, but also document some of the process. These are not things that were developed for this specifically. So they were developed more as pieces of research in order to do digital typefaces later. But they are starting points, and actually there is part Google-funded project to put some of that stuff online, which hope we go live soon. Ideally, you could have a small site where a roadmap or as plainly written as possible set of specifications or resources could be outlined, but then could be shared and become a collaborative hub for others. The stumbling block is that what the technology community is to use more is not actually so friendly for a community of educators or language professionals and so on. So if I send a teacher onto GitHub, it will actually stop them from looking further.
Yes. Yes. We have, Gerry, one more question on the chat from Parameshwari. The question is, in the context of India, where multilingualism prevails quite evidently, however, only certain languages have written script. Most of the tribal languages either use the state language script or devise their own language script, like Old Chiki. Can digitization of these languages in spoken mode be given priority than text?
I think you've hit on an area where I know very little, because probably what I'm assuming when you say digitization of languages in spoken mode is not something I have any experience in. So I'm assuming my expertise in only once there is a written form of something.
Yes.
That needs to be digitized. But you raised a very key point of an extremely diverse set of communities who have shared more to larger or small degrees the same scripts, or with variations. That raises a key problem in something that I haven't touched on, which for language professionals like you is important. The standard dictionaries that are embedded in resources. So what is a standard dictionary for anything that uses Devanagari? It's actually a really complex question that doesn't have, I don't think we can answer this at all, because there's so many languages and versions of languages and dialects that use what is the same script. That is actually quite a complex situation. For a lot of these scripts, even defining the character set or a canonical corpus of the language is a problem, is not a thing that exists readily.
Yes. Are there any other questions from the audience?
No, I can make a little comment, huh?
Please, Claudio.
As regards the question. You see, years ago, I attended a meeting where there was explained by research from Ethiopia on a methodology to preserve Agrif languages who have not written expression. But the methodology is rather different than the one we use for inclusion for languages, because to have a text in a language, you have to have a lexical scripts, information resources. I have the paper that was presented there by Mr. Nyman. I forgot his family name, but I have the paper. The point is that these are different methodologies and different concepts. Of course, now, because this was in 2003, we have had other developments, technological developments. Maybe this paper is not updated. But in any case, my comment is that these are different families of methods. As I mentioned in another meeting the other day, we have a little book for securing new languages in the cyberspace. It was a document prepared by my colleague Marcel Dick-Kidiri, but there it's oriented more or less in the line presented by Gerry Leonidas today. Of course, a lot of work has to be done to secure agraph languages in the cyberspace. That's my comment.
Gerry, any response?
No, I think you're absolutely right that there are multiple methodologies. I think what I'm talking about also betrays my own biases in terms of how I responded to the condition I found. If I'm trying to find one key mission in all of this, is that once you have access to a community, getting the information in the community is less of the problem. Greatest is usually to translate the requirements of the community, which can be quite contextual, to something that makes sense to the technology that's being used. Because the technology we're using is actually, it has quite a lot of limitations. So I cannot very easily tell my system, I'm writing an English text where I'm going to quote some Elizabethan English, and you need to use a different spelling dictionary. Or I'm using, you can apply to this, I'm writing in Hindi and then I've got a bit which is Bengali in it, and then I've got Miti Mayak in it. And you need to figure how to render these things flexibly on the fly. Now, what I described is the real scenario. There is somebody who's talking to their friend or writing, and they're using 2 or 3 languages at the same time in equivalent manner, but we don't have such a fluid system for computers. I'd like to, if I can close, Text made a point about the Western bias. There is a Western bias in our technology, which is unfortunate, and that not the digital technology, but the digital technology actually carries a lot of the baggage of the previous technologies in terms of its assumptions about how fonts work or typography works, which were not just Western, but they were English. And even worse than that, they were commercial or technology English, which is not a very complex form of the language. So you get a script that is fairly simple. It has a one-to-one relationship between visible signs and characters, doesn't use diacritics, doesn't have any complex rules. So you get a really simple language in a really simple expression. And then you use this as a basis for developing a typesetting technology. That simplicity allows the technology to develop very quickly. So it's a gift if you are a 19th century engineer where you need to move metal. But then it means that if you want to typeset Arabic or Devanagari, you've got a problem because everything else is more complex.
You see, but only to add an information, because Param Swari is from India. Last year, there was a very big meeting organized by our friends from Hyderabad University who are attending the meeting. I see Siva Prasad, etc. And I do remember that in that event, it was created a consortium to promote Indian local languages. One of the coordinators is Professor Prabhara Rao from University of Hyderabad. I believe that this initiative goes more or less in line with the Parameswari Krishnamurti preoccupations, because the idea was exactly to have a sort of local development to promote indigenous language. And our friend Siva, remember that.
Yes. See, there are 2 issues I wanted to point out here. One is, there are the state languages or the major languages which are recognized by the Constitution of India. They have scripts, and that is not a problem at all. But the indigenous communities are forced to adopt those scripts. But there are certain, communities who have, at least some of the linguists have worked on the scripts. Like I can name 2 communities. One is the Gonds. There is a Gondi language. And the other one is Savara. Savara is another tribal group or the indigenous community bordering with Andhra Pradesh and neighboring Odisha and few other states. Now, what happens is the states have no interest in developing any kind of software or anything relating to the development of these scripts. But there are experiments now in many of these tribal regions where they are trying to use their local languages, trying to teach them in the local languages. So the challenge now is we may not be able to develop script for everybody because that is a very long task. But if they are already available, we can use them, or certain special characters possibly can be devised for those languages which are, at least used largely by the communities, because most of them are multilingual. They speak 3-4 languages. In fact, in India, everybody speaks 3-4 languages. So in that context, because these communities, indigenous communities, to educate them in their own languages, in their own mother tongue, that becomes very important. Because I did one project on a community called the Lambada, or the Banjara community. They have a spoken language called Gorboli. The Gorboli is spoken, but no written script for them. They can use, some of them use Devanagari, some of them use Telugu and other languages. But then what is important for me is when I try to look at the children up to class 5, they are brought up in the family setting and they don't speak any other language other than Gorboli. So when they go to school, when they learn, they just simply see the teacher doing something, and then whatever is written on the board, they simply copy it like an artist. They move from class 1 to class 5, just pass. When they go to class 6, they are back to square one of the class 1 because they're not learned. This is a problem of teaching, problem of inculcating, because we don't have teachers who can do it. In fact, there was a project in which I was associated with a group of people. I encouraged them to at least use the Telugu script and teach students in their mother tongue. So the content has to be different than what is used in other languages. It should be mother tongue oriented content. So when we did that, up to class 5, the primers were written. That is the end of it. There was no, kind of support from anybody. So why I'm saying this, there is a sad story of many of this. But then I think we have to take proactive interest and do something. In fact, what Parmeshwar was talking about is basically that aspect. How do we, because we have to think not in the normal course, but slightly differently. This is my observation.
Thank you very much, Siva. Before we carry on, there is some questions on the chat, Gerry, if you can take a look. Unfortunately, I have to go. There are other people. You can stay on the call for as long as you want. I apologize. Our next meeting will be early September, and we will continue this conversation and everything. But please let me not stop you. Carry on.
Okay, bye, Jeanette.
Goodbye, Jeanette.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye, Gerry. The floor is yours.
Okay. I just go down the list of questions. So Craig talks about the lack of accents in the Latin ones that are needed to transcribe certain languages. How do you educate for design? So that's the specification of the character set. Again, coming back to this early research that needs to happen in any project. What are the characters that are needed for a project, and what are the features associated with those characters and the positioning and so on. Again, things are relatively easy if you can have access to someone in the community who can understand the detailed specifications that is required for typography. So somebody who's a native speaker is not enough. Somebody who's a native speaker who has an understanding perhaps of the design of documents or has an experience of authoring environments. People who are typesetters, proofreaders, editors are very useful in these environments because they will have the training to think about the letters in detail. Once you get hold of someone like that, then again, you can ask the right kind of questions to document this. But the point, I think, that you were making, Tex was making earlier, of having a standard initial set of questions. What do I ask someone if I need to build a specification for a font? Is something that is not very well documented and would be very good if we had it publicly available. Professor Sandiojo's question, I'm reading the question. Yes, I mean, my proposal is agnostic as to what people are using. It starts with the assumption that you start by asking communities what are, first of all, the written forms of the script, or the traditional forms of the script. So a lot of the research we do looks at historical manuscripts and with different sets of tools to understand also the impact of the different tools and the substrate paper or whatever it might be, tablets, on the forms of the script. Because we're making an assumption that if there are any mechanical forms of typesetting a script, that will carry the bias of the materiality of the materials used, that you have to cut punches or you have to cast letters and so on. So we'll always temper any printed research that we have with a look at the manuscript tradition of forms. And that often helps us uncover forms for the letters that might be closer to the native rendering of forms rather than what was done. That also has to do with the importation of a lot of Western technologies for making the very first versions of metal type. India is a very good example of this, where missionaries cut a lot of typefaces. Although there were locals trained, there was a very big presence by mostly British punch cutters who were making the first version of forms. And they were trying to do a good job, but they were doing it from their perspective with what they thought was a correct typographic presentation in the early 19th century, for example. So what you see there is something that carries very much the burdens of its time, but then might be locked in as a model. So they have to go back to manuscripts to uncover something more rich. It becomes more difficult to do the fewer collections or archives there are. I think the first question you might ask is, where can I find a collection of historical manuscripts for this community? Is there the equivalent of a library or an archive or an institution that collects these kinds of things? That immediately shows you a filter that is problematic, because it means that you're talking at a community that might have the institutional structures that produce collections and archives. What if you're talking about a minority that is a traveler minority, that is itinerant or doesn't have a fixed base, or its resources have been not saved? Again, that raises other problems. In those cases, you need to speak to a bit of living history research to understand how the script is being used at the time. I think that is the most interesting part of the research, to engage with the community and understand what resources there are. And usually there's more than people think, because there might be informal records or collections or a lot of information that's handed down orally that is quite useful. And people might not think of it as what is essential, but if I may be a bit crude, you know, your great grandmother's letters are actually an extremely good resource, because they show you an unmotivated writing by a person representing the language in a form that they want someone to read it. Whereas if I might say, your shopping list is not good because you're just writing to yourself and it's too quick, but correspondence is extremely useful, and so on. So it's possible to do. It's not straightforward. It depends very much on the scale of the community and the amount of resources that there are. We've done some work with Rubutun Kano, for example, which is a version of Arabic that is written in a completely different way than what is used in the Gulf, and the forms take completely different shapes, which is only possible to understand once you replicate the way of writing the script, and then you can understand. So I think doing the research in the community and the way the script is used in the community is the starting point to answering all of these questions. Craig's question again. Does it require the developers from these groups? I don't think that is a question that is easy to answer in the affirmative. It's always helpful to have people from the community, but you get the people who are interested in the community, and the people are motivated, because this is not work that anybody does because they're going to be a millionaire. It's usually slow and hard and repetitive, and sometimes it's a bit exasperating. So you need someone who's passionate. And I think you take what you get. And if then you find someone who has a combination of skills or is willing to build the skills, you support them to do it. I think having a local developer is something that accelerates things. There's a certain delay. The technical skill is not an issue. The accessibility of the technical facility to people who are local is what matters. So in a sense, I almost don't care of the nationality or the native language of the developer, but if he could be in Myanmar next to the person who's developing the next Khmer font, and they can go for a coffee together and chat and look over paper, that makes things much easier, rather than somebody having to communicate online and so on. So I think proximity with people has certain advantages in these cases that are really invaluable. So finding ways to get people together, to build some personal rapport and have the opportunity to explain things just by sitting with a notepad and sketching things side by side, that is invaluable.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I think Jeanette has, well, I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please. Sorry, I put it there, but in any case, please do use my email. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Ravi, and I work with tribal communities in India across various states. And we had a school where there were children from 5 language groups, and all these languages did not have any script. Most of the tribal communities that I work with do not have a script. There are a few who have a script. Thanks to Dr. Shiva Prasad and Jen for allowing me to get in here. So I just wanted to know, I heard all of you, it's very technical. So in what way can somebody working with the communities benefit from you, and how can the communities, well, yeah, it's mutual. So that was my practical question. Thank you.
Well, I can give you an example. Every year we have about a dozen postgraduate students, researchers who work for a whole year intensively, and they work on developing scripts that are not native to them to build this methodology. These are usually very diverse groups. They're often supported from scholarships. India is relatively good at this, at funding people to go and do this kind of study. There are programs like the Felix Foundation that give good resources, Alfred Wallace and so on. So we have the opportunity to train up some people at a very high level, and then when they go back, they can help people locally. one of the programs we have is we try to push students to also work on things that are either never digitized before, or are extinct scripts, or are the kind of minority scripts that would never get, or very difficult for them to get the mainstream attention from corporate body. These might be extinction, like Grant mentioned, or Tie a Home, and so on, that just academics or people who study the culture might be interested in, or might be minority versions. So actually, it's not such a positive, but Mitimayak, we had the first project for Mitimayak done here over 10 years ago. And it was the first case of digital interpretation of the script that was competent. So what is helpful is for people to get in touch and say, we need this.
Okay.
That is a very good starting point. People like Craig are well connected. We have a good relation also with the Endangered Scripts project. So we try to be up to date with what we recommend, get some resource, because then we can connect someone who can deal with the technical issues for you, and you can support them in giving them the community aspects.
So if I understand you right, there can be help in trying to record the languages that don't have a script, one. And two,
that's
maybe
something that we can do.
Pardon?
We can only work once there has been a transcription of the language. So we're one step later. We're one step later.
Okay.
But if say I've taken, I don't know, I've taken Telugu and I've added these combinations.
Okay.
And I don't have a font that makes them, then this is the stage where we can be involved and help with that.
Yeah. Okay. Have you looked at Kui language, the Khones?
No, personally, no. But we haven't had any requests for that. Yeah.
Okay. There was a German person who tried to develop a script for Kui. I'll try to. Yeah. So I would be really interested because, as I understand, once a language is lost, everything is lost. So we are interested if we can work with you people and see that some of these, if not everything, is saved or something like that.
Absolutely. We can help once somebody has done the transcription. Okay. We don't have any expertise in transcribing the language. That's a linguist's job. But once a linguist comes and says, look, I've made this mark and I need to make these things correspond to something I type on my keyboard, that's the bit where we can help.
All right. Got you. So we'll try to, maybe with Dr. Shiva Prasad, we'll work and try to do something. Thank you.
Please get in touch then. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Perhaps I can inject very briefly here. The amazing thing with the modern world is that there are now video and audio tools available to almost everyone who has an internet connection. And these can be very valuable for communications, even with languages that do not have a written form. The challenge is, of course, that discovering these resources is very difficult. And I think it's very important to find ways to say that this particular video or this particular audio file are in a language, and there are language codes that can be added to these to make them discoverable around the world. Without those digital names being used consistently for these audio and visual materials, they get lost in the internet. So there are some resources for non-written languages, but we definitely have many more tools for languages that are written already.
Interesting. Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's a little technical for me. It's the first time, so I'm trying to get a grip. I know I just work with the communities, so
sure.
I'll try to understand your points and reach up and help these communities. Definitely. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
This is
It's
the right
opened a new avenue for me.
good. This is the right group to engage to ask your questions and engage us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, I've given my email in the chat. If anybody has any follow-up questions or anything to talk, I'm very happy to be contacted and we open up some avenues for collaboration.
Thank you so much, Gerry, for your wonderful discussion of this topic. It's very helpful, and I look forward to learning more about this. And I hope that others will continue to ask questions and that we can talk about other technical aspects of the Language Digitization Initiative in the future.
It's a pleasure. Very good to meet you all again. Thank you for your patience also, and goodbye.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night.
Good night.